Hans von Bülow wrote that Beethoven's Diabelli Variations are, as he wrote it in German, ein Mikrokosmos des Beethoven'schen Genius, ja sogar ein Abbild der ganzen Tonwelt. Which means something like they are not only a microcosm of Beethoven's genius, but they even represent music as a whole, or literally translated, they represent the world of sound as a whole. Hans von Bülow's quotation clearly emphasizes the absolutely unique position of this greatest piano work of the classical period, not only within Beethoven's own oeuvre, but in the whole history of music. His judgment is of particular interest because he was the first pianist ever who performed the complete Diabelli Variations in public. And this happened in 1856, which means 33 years after they had been published and 29 years after Beethoven's death. And until the end of the 19th century, he remained one of only very few pianists performing them. And almost all of the other pianists who did this were either his own students or students of his teacher Franz Liszt. And only after the first acoustic recording by Artur Schnabel in the 1930s, the piece became part of the repertoire of a greater number of pianists. All this reflects not only the frightening challenge that it means to learn this huge work, but probably also the pianist's worries about whether all the effort that is needed will in the end produce something that an average audience will enjoy. One aspect of this work that makes it difficult to understand for a listener, of course beyond the enormous duration of the piece, one aspect is the fact that Beethoven permanently surprises the listener, and often enough in a way which may even deceive the listener's expectations. Also, Beethoven rarely groups a greater number of variations in a way that will produce a longer context, and if it happens that there is such a context, it will always break at a point where the listener finally started to think that he can anticipate the further development. Actually, already the way how Beethoven treats the repeats is remarkable and totally unpredictable. While the theme is extremely symmetric and has both equally long parts being repeated, Beethoven in his variations sometimes repeats both parts, sometimes only the first, sometimes only the second, sometimes even just only a shorter passage, while in other cases there is no repeat at all. Now to come back to the greater context, towards the end of the cycle, things seem to become a bit more like what we would expect. 3 beautiful, slow variations in minor key in a row, getting increasingly deep and expressive, just what we expect from a late work by a composer. Then a wonderful contrast with a very energetic and virtuosic fugue. Unfortunately, the fugue is in the wrong key of E flat major, so the piece cannot end in a triumphant and virtuosic way with this fugue. Although we must say that originally Beethoven really intended to end with a fugue, but there are no sketches remaining which would explain how he could then have solved the problem of the wrong key. Anyway, it is as it is, so after the fugue there must be something more. Maybe the theme again? Like in Bach's Goldberg Variations, or like in Beethoven's own variations from the Sonata Opus 109. But don't forget, it's not his own theme. So this fact alone means that it would probably not be a good idea to have it in the ending of the piece, regardless of whether the theme at all would be suitable to end the piece. So, there has to be yet another variation after the fugue. Beethoven chooses to write it in the style of a minuet, which means he's somewhat going back in history to the time before the waltz, from where this long journey had started. And even this minuet in itself is full of surprises. At some place in the coda it almost seems like the composer is going to start yet another variation, but this kind of falls apart in a way, and then unexpectedly there's a short moment, very deep, which seems to remind us the arietta of Opus 111. After this, it almost seems like now it's going to develop into a virtuosic ending, but no, it won't, and it really remains unpredictable until the final chord, which is, by the way, on the second beat and not on the first beat of the bar as everybody would expect. Many more things could be said about the variations, but any attempt to say something complete enough to bring justice to the complexity of this work would take hours and should rather be written down in a very large book. I would therefore prefer to focus on just one particular aspect, an aspect that cannot easily be described in written words, but which needs sound examples. I am very lucky to present you Fatjona Maliqi, who has been my student for a number of years and who contributes a complete performance of Beethoven's Diabelli Variations to this conference. In the process of studying the piece, she has done something quite interesting that we would like to present. The general thought behind what we are going to do now is, when we study a piece of a certain complexity, it is always important to be aware of what makes it so special. And this cannot be achieved by theoretically analyzing the piece, because as a performer we don't just have to know, but we have to feel what is special. And the best way to awaken and to permanently refresh this feeling is to be very conscious about how this or that passage would be expected to be normally. So for our practical work, that means we should often rearrange the music in such a way that it sounds or it looks like what a more conventional composer would have written, or what a normal listener would have expected. Then, after playing this, or after listening to this, we will strongly feel the different effect of what the composer actually wrote. I can tell you this can be done in each of the 33 variations. We have just chosen 2 examples, and we do it on purpose to start with an example which seems actually very unspectacular and which really needs such kind of analysis in order to make us aware of what is special. Before we analyze this example from variation 18, let's start by reminding us the theme. It is indeed very clear and symmetric. For all our purpose, let's just focus on the first two short phrases, which are almost equal, and both of which consist of two, let's say, dialoguing elements. Okay, Fatjona, could you just play the first phrase of the theme? Okay, you saw I made her stop at a certain moment. You could say it started with a kind of statement and then came the reply. And the second phrase has exactly the same structure. Okay, now let's see what Beethoven does with this structure in variation 18. It starts from a kind of inversion of the original motive. Is transformed into, so becomes. Let's see what Beethoven does with this. Okay, so now I always played this reply, but this is not exactly what Beethoven wrote. That was our arrangement. Let's first check what he does special in the first phrase. First we do again this arrangement. So that would be perfectly logic, and I played exactly the melody phrase that Beethoven wrote as an answer, but let's see, Beethoven does something slightly different. So contrary to what we heard in the theme, he does not remain in the same key, but he switches to A minor, which gives an element of darkness to the piece. Now let's check what he does with the second phrase. So first we play our arrangement. In fact, Beethoven does almost the same, but slightly different. So in these cases it was not about changing it harmonically, but the metric structure was changed. We have this extremely clear and simple structure, like a perfect rhyme in the theme. And he could have done it like we arranged it, so it would be perfectly symmetric. Musically it would absolutely make sense, but he avoids this regularity. It is very important to understand that this irregularity is much more than just a little detail. On the contrary, this is something which clearly distinguishes Opus 120 from all other variation cycles by Beethoven. The often discussed simplicity of Diabelli's theme boosts Beethoven's creativity, and it's exactly this simplicity of the theme which allows him to produce an incredible number of more or less obvious and always very creative irregularities in these 33 variations. Now let's see what Beethoven does at the beginning of the second half of this variation. which I call the reply, is now in the very high register, which gives a beautiful, sweet or mystic or whatever you mean sound effect. But still, this is not exactly what Beethoven wrote. Fatjona made an arrangement where, in the end, the harmonic tension is resolved as we would expect it and as it is done in the theme. But in reality, Beethoven keeps it in suspense, which makes it even more magical. Can you now play the original version? Let's now discuss the third variation, and this one is particularly interesting. Already the background of composing this variation is interesting because initially it was supposed to be the first variation of the cycle, and we have some earlier manuscripts which let us understand what a great transformation this had to undergo until the final result that we know now. Maybe let's get started by listening to the first two phrases of the first half of the variation. Yeah, so that's very nice, but nothing really special is happening here. And now let's listen the corresponding two phrases at the beginning of the second part of the variation, and let's see what happens then. Yeah, so that's not very unexpected. It's almost the same structure, so quite what we would expect, but this is not what Beethoven wrote. Yes, initially when we see the earlier sketches, the variation was quite different in a way, but still it was very clear that he was going to have this similarity at the beginning of the variation and the two corresponding phrases at the beginning of the second half of the variation. So the second half, it started with this motive, and very logically the second phrase starts in a different tonality, and so on. That would be very logical. Maybe you just play this once again so we hear it again to remember it. Second phrase, Beethoven starts with, but then happens something very strange. He doesn't develop it like we just heard, what would have been logical, but very different. Isn't that totally amazing? For me, it is a very irritating moment in this variation, which started so nice and so friendly, but now we cannot be sure anymore if there isn't something dark and disturbing behind the friendly facade. Alfred Brendel had the genius idea to give every variation a characteristic headline or title. And for this variation he wrote Zutrauen und nagender Zweifel, confidence and nagging doubts. The polarity of characters Brendel describes so strikingly is not only found in this variation, but in the whole cycle. And this is exactly what makes it so fascinating. Once you open your mind for this experience, you will enjoy every moment of this very, very long work. And after traveling through this microcosm of Beethoven's genius, you will fully agree with Hans von Bülow's enthusiastic judgment. We both hope that this introduction has contributed maybe just a little bit to your understanding of the countless wonders of Beethoven's Diabelli Variations, and that you will enjoy Fatjona's complete performance on the YouTube channel of EPTA Germany.